I think it's important to understand that the challenge of learning poverty is something which has come to light in a context in which we've made significant improvements in access. So over the past few decades, we've seen more and more children able to attend school throughout the African continent. There's been significant progress made in this area. This goes back to the Millennium Development Goals, and that's then reiterated within SDG 4.0, so the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which looks specifically at access to quality education internationally, and that's of course relevant in the context of Africa. The challenge is that as we've seen learning data, assessment data, coming in from these schools where we've seen improvements in access, we haven't seen commensurate improvements in learning outcomes. And in some contexts, we've seen learning outcomes decline. So effectively, we have more children in school, but the children aren't learning. Now, the scale of this problem is quite significant. So for example, in some parts of Africa, as many as 9 out of 10 children are effectively leaving primary school unable to read or write. And so this is at its heart the challenge of learning poverty, that children are increasingly attending school. Obviously some children are still out of school and we need to address that also, but increasingly attending school, but they're not learning when they're there. And that's the issue that we're really seeking to address today is first of all, how can we make sure all children have access to learning and teaching, and then ensuring that that learning and teaching is of sufficient quality to ensure strong learning outcomes in terms of attainment and progress for all of the children in Africa. So there are lots of reasons that have precipitated the extent of the learning poverty crisis in Africa. So one is resourcing. So we see insufficient allocation of resourcing to education, particularly primary education and early childhood education. UNICEF has consistently advocated that that should at the very least be proportionate. And there's a long body of research from the late Christopher Colclough and others highlighting that when we invest in early childhood education and in primary education, so when we invest in that foundational learning, we see a really strong return on that investment. So there's a bigger bang for buck, as it were, when we invest in foundational learning than in subsequent phases. But in a lot of African countries, you still see a lot of resourcing, for example, allocated to higher education, which tends to benefit those who can already access education effectively. So there's an ongoing advocacy case for increased resourcing to education in general, but in particular proportionate resourcing to early childhood education and foundational learning. We see challenges with regard to teacher absenteeism. It's particularly challenging getting quality educators into rural areas. You see that across the continent. That's not unique to Africa. You see that in South Asia and elsewhere also. Accountability mechanisms need to be strengthened within the education systems to ensure that we're expecting the very best from the pedagogues who are in schools. In many contexts, the governance and oversight of schools has been undermined. So in theory, a lot of schools throughout the continent should have boards comprising community representatives, parent representatives, teacher representatives. In many cases, those haven't been active or haven't been constituted, so there's a lack of oversight. And also, because of the success in pushing free primary education throughout the continent and giving children access to education that is free at point of use in many contexts, in some contexts that has undermined the level of ownership and control that parents have, because they no longer have that transactional relationship with the school and the school leaders. And so in some contexts, there's evidence that dynamic has been undermined. And that's not an argument against free primary education, but it's a challenge which we need to address to ensure that the expectations of parents are consistently addressed by schools. What we know works in terms of strengthening learning outcomes. So we can talk about teacher absenteeism, but there's also a question about the quality of learning and teaching in the classroom. And what we would like to see is this evidence-based approach where we know that there are approaches such as teaching at the right level, mother tongue instruction, structured pedagogy, which are effective. The mapping exercise has been split into 2 components. One of those components looks at pedagogic interventions like the ones I've discussed, and the other looks at enabling environment factors such as school feeding initiatives. Now, school feeding initiatives are not a pedagogic interaction, but they do improve access. And there's also evidence that even where you have quite high levels of access, children who are better nourished, who have a better nutritional background, are more able to access learning. School feeding programs being implemented in Ethiopia and throughout the continent in areas affected by crisis, and then in some cases as a matter of systemic need. So these school feeding programs, as said, they strengthen access and they also strengthen the capacity for learning on the part of the pupils. And so both of these components, the pedagogic interventions and the enabling environment interventions, are important. But at the very heart, if you want to cut through all of the evidence, we know that the most important factor is access to quality learning and teaching. And quality learning and teaching, we know what the push factors are there. I suppose there are three key takeaways here. So one is that we need to be led by evidence. One of the challenges with learning poverty, we have a gap in the assessment data with regard to foundational learning. And so it's hard for governments to identify which demographics, which groups, which areas need this support. So gathering quality data on learning outcomes at the end of primary, effectively, is really, really important to ensuring that we can plan quality interventions to strengthen foundational literacy and numeracy. So that's one, being led by evidence. Two, thinking about what works and not being distracted by things that don't. So when we're developing education sector plans, when we're developing national compacts, making sure that governments draw on the evidence, look at what they know works, what can be scalable, and implement that in a considered way, and not be distracted by costly engagements that don't necessarily drive learning outcomes. And then finally, we need to make sure that we act with urgency, because the scale of the problem is very, very significant. So if for a whole region of Africa, 9 out of 10 children are effectively leaving primary school unable to read or write, that has the capacity to hugely undermine the scope for economic development of African countries, particularly given the demographic dividend that many African countries will enjoy. So this is a matter of urgency, and it's for that reason that UNICEF and the African Union Commission have launched the ELPAF campaign to end learning poverty in Africa, with a mandate from the AU Summit, building on the Nouakchott Declaration, which took place in Mauritania last year. In December 2024, the inaugural Continental Education Conference ended with the Nouakchott Declaration, where ministers and heads of state made specific calls, and one of those was the elimination of learning poverty in Africa by 2035.